Hi, welcome everyone to the Yale Center for British Arts online series At Home, Artists in Conversation. I am Alexis Lowry, curator at Dia Art Foundation in New York, and I'm really delighted to welcome Prem Sahib to our program today. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather questions for Prem, and they will be answered at the end of the program. So please feel free to drop them in as we go throughout the program, but just know we will get to them at the end. I'm going to read Yale University's land acknowledgement right now. Yale University acknowledges that the indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scaticook, Golden Hill, Pagosset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Before I introduce Prem, I want to just thank everybody at Yale who was so incredibly helpful as we organized this talk. So Jane Nowosadoko, Linda Payne, and of course, Courtney Martin. It's such a pleasure to be here having this conversation. Prem Sahib was born in London in 1982 and is a British artist of Indian and Polish descent. Sahib works primarily in sculpture, installation, performance, and sound and photography. They received a BA in Fine Art in 2006 from the Slade School of Art in London, an MA in Material and Visual Culture in 2008 from the University College London, and a postgraduate diploma in fine art in 2013 from the Royal Academy of Arts, also in London. Often minimal and sparse in color, Sahib's work explores themes including relationships, intimacy and sexuality, community, alienation, and confinement. Their work is informed by an interest in the architecture of meeting places, particularly for gay and queer communities, and Sahib has had numerous solo and exhibitions and group shows, and their work is in collections worldwide. And I was lucky enough to meet and visit Prem in his studio in the before times, around 2018. And it's a real pleasure to be able to have this conversation today and to kind of see where the work is developed from. So without further ado, I'm just going to advance the slides. And I should just note, we have, for those of you in the audience today, Prem and I had a little bit of trouble editing because there's so much great stuff to talk about. So we're going to get through as much as we can. And if we don't get to all of them, all of our slides, we won't. So Prem, hi.
Hi, Alexis. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and everyone at Yale as well, like you mentioned, who have made this happen. So thank you.
I really wanted to start by asking you how you came to making work at all. So sort of how you became an artist and kind of what your early access points were to, or conceptual frameworks were for making the work that you do.
Well, I guess I never really thought of being an artist, or being an artist wasn't something that was like a career possibility for me. I just sort of followed my interests. And I think it was at a foundation course in 2001 that I realized I had a strong affinity towards sculpture in particular. I also was really drawn to graphic design, and those kind of skills helped me kind of support myself through education, actually, because I was a designer for many years doing print design. But there was something about sculpture and I guess its relationship to kind of weight and emotion, or the act of moving or carrying something from one place to another, that really appealed to me, and it really stayed with me. And I kind of like thinking about its transformative capacity today still. And it's the sort of medium that I tend to work with most. So I kind of ended up going to the Slade School of Fine Art and specializing in sculpture. But then in between my postgrad at the Royal Academy schools, I did this kind of master's in anthropology. And I think that came about really as a way to maybe think about contextualizing my work outside of like art history, because I was sort of running into sort of problems about how to talk about things that I was interested in, and sort of anthropology became this area that really helped me through that. But the slide that you have up now is actually something that I made as a student as well. So this was like 18 years ago. And it was a video that kind of always lived in my imagination for so long because I lost it. And a friend recently discovered it on an old hard drive. So I was lucky enough to see it again. And what really stood out to me was how many themes that I think are still kind of questions in my practice that the kind of the work still has. And I'll try and explain what it is exactly, but on the right, you're looking at a still from an 8-minute video. And it was this kind of makeshift table that I put together in my auntie's garden. So my auntie, who lives across the road from where I lived in Southall, I produced this work by myself, you know, in a very kind of like independent way, filming it, editing it, and setting it up. And it was this kind of like offering to the night. And I remember there being this kind of sensor, the sort that kind of becomes activated by someone's presence. And I just sat there all night, basically in the dark. And then there were moments where this fox appeared and kind of jumped on the table and kind of helped themselves to the food that I had laid out.
Sorry, the fox was unscripted, right?
Yeah, well, I knew that there was like, I guess it was like, I knew that this charged like kind of encounter may happen. And so I was kind of like offering that food to entice it maybe. And then I sort of edited it down to like these 8 minutes. So it's like a single shot frame that's just still. And when it jumps on the table, you kind of see the water, you know, in the vase sort of being disturbed. And there's something about the precarity of the whole situation and its fragility and like whether something will appear or whether it won't, that I think are still things that kind of live on in my work today. And also this interest in the domestic and ideas around home or intrusion and boundaries and just the negotiation of shared space, I guess, which I think extends to more recent work too. And then where you see it on a stage was a more recent presentation in an exhibition, a group exhibition in Auckland in New Zealand. And the show was called Day Night. So it was kind of really appropriate and fitting.
I love that it was shown in this kind of intergenerational space. I think it's called the Old Folks Association, which is the best name I've heard in a long time for a presenting space. But because that also comes back to something we'll talk about a little bit later in terms of your thinking about across generations in your work. But I love what you were saying about the Fox piece, kind of dealing with this question of the relationship between like public intimacy, right? Like intimacy or domesticity, or something private that unfolds in a public space. And I think so much of your work deals with like the body's position in public space. You've said kind of recently that you were in your practice, you're trying to examine how relationships with objects in the built environment has an effect on us and how we become who we become, and the reciprocal relationship between the world we make and the world as it makes us as kind of moral people. And I think this is a really powerful and a kind of evocative and provocative statement about the way that your work functions. And I wonder if you could talk about it, particularly in relationship to these kind of sculptures that invite the body to participate.
I mean, this may be quite a good example to talk about actually, because I can speak about my use of tiles, which I think is maybe a useful example in that, you know, I'm thinking about the specifics of materials used in public design, for example, that have a powerful effect on how we move around a space or how specific functionality is created. And I had been using these types of materials for some time. And this work that we're looking at is called a passing. So it's this kind of archway with matte tiles on the exterior and reflective tiles on the interior. So it kind of becomes this invitation for viewers to pass through. And as you do, you momentarily see your reflection. And I was looking at the kind of architecture of like doorways or kind of cubicles, perhaps like you might find in public toilets. And sort of going back to this thing about the quote that you mentioned, I remember, for instance, standing in front of a urinal in a kind of public toilet, which was a known cruising space, and seeing this reflection of the park outside in the kind of banal white tiles that faced me while I was at the urinal. And it's kind of these moments of realizing opportunity structures in materials or kind of novel ways to engage with a space that are maybe counter to how it's organized. So obviously in a space like a public toilet, that everything is sort of directed around a particular functionality. And I kind of like how you might use materials, or there might be these sort of flirtations with certain materials or formal arrangements that kind of allow you to do other things in space or kind of direct your own narrative through it.
I think that's really interesting also in this installation where you also dealt with the window in a kind of unique way. So just sort of thinking about, I love that description of opportunities in structures as they kind of already, in materials as they already exist, and exploiting them. So maybe you could talk about how that functioned in this installation.
Yeah, so this is a installation shot of my exhibition at the ICA in 2015. It was called Side On. So I kind of liked how the title suggested a different way of looking at something as opposed to maybe looking at it front on. And in the back wall that you see has all been clad with wood in order to install this light box, which appears as though it's a window. And it's a sort of window that you would find in a space like a public toilet, for instance, where it's purposely placed high up to sort of to kind of bring in light, but also to kind of like prevent any kind of visual exchange between the outside and the inside, so that the space becomes so much about interiority. And so I was playing a lot with those kind of ideas of the downstairs galleries becoming this kind of hermetic space. And then you see a similar work with these two archways that are kind of look like they may have collapsed or somehow in a kind of in a union, perhaps like a temporary union, and they kind of like fleshy tones. And yeah, this again is like an instance of like how my tile works become architectural. And it's a series began with a single column, which I think we may have an image of as well, that was called, that you can see on the concourse there. So this work was called a watch queen, which is like the colloquial name given to people in cruising situations that are kind of looking out for anything that might interrupt the action. So it's like I was trying to ascribe something figurative to this object so that it kind of acquires this person-like stature. And the placement of it was also significant because it was in the concourse. So it kind of surveyed the exhibition a bit. And yeah, those ideas of like where an object becomes a body and a body becomes an object are things I was particularly at this time thinking about a lot. And you can't quite see this object in the back, but there's a larger white structure which deviates from these more
Sorry, I was just
formal
seeing if we had it.
It's okay.
Sorry.
These more formal archways and columns, because it's from the front, it looks like a sort of domestic sofa that's been significantly scaled up, perhaps to sort of accommodate like lots of bodies. And it was a site for a still life. So I had all these different components that that kind of formed a narrative collectively. And this was the only object that has sort of got a real world kind of connection in a way. So these other forms are things that maybe reference architectures that we might be used to, like doorways and bathrooms and cubicles. But the big large white sculpture in the back, that was taken from, well, not taken, but it came about through my experience of this gay bathhouse in Shoreditch in East London, which I think we'll kind of maybe come to a bit later. But I just wanted to mention it because here I was sort of transcribing some of the furniture I was finding in certain spaces using my body and using the tiles as a way to kind of create these bodily approximations as well. So like, even though the tiles I use tend to be industrially produced, they still retain something of like the hand of the tiler through their scale. And going back to these more simplified forms, you know, I'm interested in how things like tiles reiterate ideological ideas as well about hygiene, cleanliness, or become this surface that suggests something that can be wiped clean.
I think that's one of the things I find most compelling about your work in tile is that it is this kind of like hygienic, almost sterile material that you've managed to make, like, it's incredibly sexy, right? It's like intimate. You want to, I mean, they're so tender with each other and their forms are so somehow inviting because of, for example, in a passing, that oscillation between a matte and a shiny. So like allowing the material to kind of transgress its typical function or its sort of typical identity, I think also speaks to the ways in which you think about how bodies transgress public spaces or the kind of established, or normative modes of being in public spaces. I think also, though, this question of intimacy is really present in these works as well, this kind of like squeezing and pressing. And at the same time, they have this kind of, they're also kind of removed, they're in these frames. So these are these puffer jackets that are compressed into these glass cases. So they're kind of both incredibly dense and contained and almost archival, but at the same time, like deeply intimate because of how much pressure there is between the two. So I wonder if you could talk about them a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, like, in the same vein of like using these tiled surfaces that I kind of don't like attachments, basically, like we mentioned, the materials that can be wiped clean. I was also thinking about these works maybe in relation to attachments as well, but maybe kind of forcibly trying to bring them together, things that don't stick, and suspend them in this kind of momentary union. So with these puffer jacket works, it was sort of about compressing them, almost like, when you examine something under a slide, there was something of that about it as well. And in this, I mean, they evolved from works that kind of began on the wall, and then in this instance, they became a bit like sculpture in the round. They were sort of stacked on top of one another. So, like I mentioned, trying to make the downstairs gallery of this space like really hermetic, they kind of just, all the reflections in the surface became more enhanced. And to kind of add to that, there were these kind of cast jasmonite eggs that were placed at kind of suggestive height, so that they kind of also kind of signaled something bodily in a way. But yeah, no, I was using a lot of these jackets at the time and just thinking about materials that kind of cushion us or sit in between us and our environment, and forms that we can sometimes like hide behind. And of course, that capacity to blend or be anonymous has different consequences for different bodies. But I was sort of thinking about these jackets as sort of multiples of the same form, which are so ubiquitous, much like the kind of tiling that I use as well, and kind of speak of consumer culture in a certain way. So in becoming uniforms, I wanted them to become like further restricted, through their kind of being compressed in glass as well. And then these ones that you see, some of them have headphones in them. So they're kind of, again, I don't know, harking to connectivity in some way. And they become quite ambiguous for me too. Like the middle one that you see here is called Rumble, and sort of like, it could be anything from like a loving embrace to something more violent even.
So one of the things that just struck me is you're talking about this kind of the capacity to be anonymous that this kind of almost urban uniform allows. And I'm sort of thinking about that in relationship to kind of standardizations. And when we talk about minimal art, which your work often gets described under the umbrella of because of its kind of visual restraint, one thing that artists early in the 60s and 70s were looking at is materials that were kind of standardized to the body so that they were easy to move, but configured in relationships that tried to eschew any other external meaning. And I'm wondering how, you've talked a little bit about trying to destabilize or queer the associations of the tradition of minimalism. And I'm wondering how you see your work in relationship to that.
Yeah, I mean, I totally get that about the standardization of these forms. And that's definitely something that I was also interested in, like, the many ways that like the same form is like offered up when it's actually quite a rigid sort of means of differentiating, through color, perhaps any kind of way of expressing beyond the form itself. But I think there's also the autobiographical starting point that sort of comes into my work as well, that kind of maybe disrupts that narrative or relationship to minimalism in that way a bit more. Yeah, so there's often these kind of biographical starting points that I'm not so much wedded to. Like, I kind of like the idea of skewing them or them becoming disrupted somehow, but they are nonetheless there. And I like to think about how I can abstract them as well. So to explore kind of like personal narratives in a way.
So I think we should just float through a few images quickly, just in the interest of time.
Sure.
But again, I love what you're saying about kind of thinking about indexing the body and then a kind of relationship to a kind of personal biography versus a kind of more abstracted kind of human condition. And these sculptures breathe, right? They move between each light, neon lights up at a kind of different pace. Was the pacing tied to anybody's actual breath, or?
I mean, I guess in some respects it was maybe tied to mine, because it was like a process of giving them that pace, but they began as what I was calling dead neon. So if you imagine the tiled structures that I was making, I was adding these kind of pieces of black glass to them and sort of like trying to make them stick, these two slippery, cold materials. And I was calling them dead neons because they were kind of like the carcass of the neon. They were the glass without any of the components that make them light up. So when I took them off those structures and they sort of were boisterously placed as though they're kind of like darting around a room, I digitally programmed them to simulate breathing. So they kind of like, they light up and then they dim again. So I would say probably my breath, but yeah, they have a relationship to these paintings, actually, the next slide that you just showed. Yeah.
Thinking in terms of touch. Yeah. So I'm just going to show a couple of these and then maybe we can talk about them. This is the most recent one. This is, I think, a good one to kind of settle on for a second. These are called the sweat paintings. Could you tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. So they're hand painted, using resin. And they're painted dot by dot. So it's a really meticulous process. I'm currently working on one which I've been doing during lockdown, and they take hundreds of hours to produce. And they have this kind of like, they look like a wet surface where the surface has been interrupted through kind of abstract bodily marks. So like the first one that you showed in silver has these kind of quite chaotic finger marks running through it. And I sort of began making them on silver anodized metal. So they look, for me, they're kind of a lot about the kind of substance and surface touching. So they're to do with contact in some ways. But what became interesting for me is kind of like using the same clear resin on different colored surfaces meant that they were sort of became codified in different ways. So the yellow one, for example, becomes more pissy. The red one became more bloody, and the kind of compositions and the mark making sort of developed in various ways based on the relationship with the surface too. But they were kind of born out of the neons in a way, which also kind of occupy this very like bodily sphere, but become like, they kind of reify these quite abstract marks.
Yeah, and I love the way they index touch, and fluids, or kind of like,
yeah.
I mean, because breath too is a fluid in it in some ways too, right? So these kind of intangible, unfixed bodily connotations. Your work often indexes the body in different ways. We'll just look at a few of these kind of works from your jewelry series. Maybe we'll settle on this one because it'll take us to the next exhibition that you worked on as well. But how did you start thinking about jewelry and kind of your use of these kind of blown up bodily elements, bodily decorations?
I think like really just about kind of things that sit close to the body and mediate ideas around value, both for the person looking at it and the person wearing it. And so I've made like various forms of jewelry scaled up that then sort of end up treating the architecture almost like a body as well. But in this instance, it kind of became something different. So I made these like oversized piercings that fixed this plaster relief to the wall in a way that looked like it was also being prized off the wall. And I mentioned this sauna chariots that I was kind of making, in some ways making work about my experiences there at the time of the ICA show. But the sauna itself closed in 2016, I think. And we mentioned kind of intergenerational spaces, but for me, like this was a space that, yes, sex was part of the design, but it was also a community space in many ways. And actually, like for me at least, it was in some ways more diverse in some of the gay bars in the same area because it had such a kind of, you know, like intergenerational crowd. But this sauna closed, and so I was able to work with some of the objects that were once fixtures and fittings of the place, and it kind of got me thinking about them and my experiences there slightly differently. So I found these replicas of this relief that was always around the sauna, where, you know, this Greek god is awarding this kind of white athletic body somehow. And I started to think about this image of whiteness and how it's like, how it has this sort of incorrigible presence in the space. And so piercing it was a way to sort of not so much dismantle it, but to weaken it somehow and to sort of prize it away from the wall. And
just on the subject of that kind of that Greco-Roman idealized body.
Yeah,
this was also
David's
pulled
head.
from.
Yeah.
But pulled from this isn't actually cast from the version at Chariots, right?
No, there were a number of things that I kind of I couldn't just take from the space. But when this was from an exhibition in Hamburg, and I happened to find the exact same one, so I was able to cast it and kind of manipulate it in this kind of plastic way, so that it became more of a ruin. And I had it on this IKEA sofa, which was something that I was kind of noticing online in webcams for various kind of like chem search parties, but also like it spoke a lot to me of the kind of moment that we were in terms of like housing and kind of this being sort of very tasteful and affordable modular sofa. So yeah, the two objects sat together in this exhibition at the Kunstverein in Hamburg called Balconies.
Yeah, this kind of, unhappy marriage between a kind of the interior furniture of gentrification and the kind of removal of these spaces as a result of gentrification, right?
Yeah, and it was kind of cast in this sort of purpley plaster, which kind of looked, or I was thinking about it a little bit in relation to like asphyxiated flesh or something. So had this kind of really crumbly, but kind of fleshy, blood-filled association.
Okay, so just looking at a couple of these kind of cast resin sculptures that I will just show them really quickly because they're really, really beautiful. These kind of found objects that get encased in resin that are kind of almost taxonomic in the same way that, or taxidermic almost in the same way that the puffer jackets are. It's kind of thinking about archival practices and kind of preserving history is something that was really important to the Kunstvereiner installation, right? Balconies, which we're looking at here. And maybe you could talk about these lockers.
Yeah. So the title.
I'm showing images as you go.
And the title of the exhibition came about from all these new builds that I was seeing by my studio that had these balconies outside, and I kind of realized them, or was thinking about that as providing this sort of perspective just outside of the domestic. And I described sort of working with some of the objects that once existed at Chariots. Well, these lockers that comprise the main work in the space were found objects that were just being discarded in the car park with a sign that said, "Please help yourself." So I did, and I lived with them for some time before I eventually decided on them being a work. But it became important to me that they stay together as a sort of family of objects. And I think that collectively they kind of spoke about the space in which they came from through their material culture. And so I kind of felt that they were preserving something of that, a document of that space somehow. And many of them had stickers in them, some for gay street artists, other for kind of housing associations or like public health messages. But one sticker that was always repeated in many of them was for an old condom campaign from the 90s, sorry. The sticker read, "Do you care? We do." And so that became the title of the work. And it kind of summarized this question for me about like, how does one navigate being an individual as part of a community? And I guess because I had these works that spoke about a kind of collective in a way, to counter that, I had a work in this sort of dark room that I built, which was far more personal. And it was like a replica of my first birthday cake. And I worked with a food model maker to produce that from this image that you see here on the left. And in contrast to the lockers, it kind of became this quite strange moment that felt quite like out of body. So you were in this dark room space, you kind of came across this thing, and I was interested in how it spoke both of my kind of heritage in a way through the inclusion of my full name, but also became this kind of object that was consumed by like a family, a community, and celebrated to some extent my identity before one had really emerged. So it was like my first birthday cake.
Right, it's almost more for your parents than it is for you at that point.
Yeah. So it had the exact same chairs I managed to source and the same tablecloth, all that kind of thing.
It's so interesting the way you're talking about that kind of this persistent interest in communities and thinking about the relationship between communities and care, because of something that you said earlier about why you were drawn to sculpture at first, which was this kind of idea of like literally carrying materials. There's a kind of sense of care that is required for that, right? Like a sense of tactile care. That seems such a like ongoing aspect of your work. That's really fascinating. The kind of exhibitions that we've looked at really take these abstract forms that you're working with, or even when they're found, kind of like abstracted elements, but they're carefully composed. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit before we talk about your most recent exhibition, really quickly about your approach to exhibition making and kind of the relationship between kind of constructing narratives and then these abstracted individual objects within the exhibition.
Well, I've used abstraction sometimes as a strategy to work with ideas and sort of afford me a kind of flexibility in space with them in some way. So I don't really mean so much like evading anything, but kind of allowing it to exist in a way that isn't always so fixed. And then like as a consequence of being fixed, it could become kind of categorized and regulated in ways that maybe I wouldn't want. So it's sort of become this generative space, working through abstraction sometimes. And then, sorry, the other question was about exhibition making.
Well, I'm just interested in how, I mean, I feel like the work, especially with the Kunstverein show and the most recent exhibition, which is this kind of episodic 3-part exhibition that we'll talk about, there's a kind of interest in creating or constructing a kind of more narrative framework within the exhibition for the viewer, whilst you still have somehow managed to leave each individual object its own autonomy, which is always the case, right? Nothing's overprescribed by this. And I'm wondering if that's an explicit strategy of yours or something that's just happened.
No, I mean, I do think about individual objects, but then also their kind of relationship to other things, and exhibitions often become an opportunity to explore that further, to see how things are kind of complicated by one another, but also kind of strengthen. And kind of, I think I like transporting a viewer in different ways. And so that might be through kind of like formal or material properties, but it might also be through objects that take them literally to a space. And I guess that's just like quite like a basic sculptural thing in a way. You know, how does something make you come right up to its surface? So even like the sweat panels, for instance, despite being paintings, I sort of think they operate in quite a sculptural way. They're almost invisible, so they kind of really invite you close. Or does it make you bend down? And like, you know, how does it make you, does it obstruct your path? So I really enjoy exhibition making in terms of like how I sort of figure out those relationships more. But recently I've also been thinking about the kind of exhibition as a work in a way. And so I think that's maybe, like you mentioned this, one of my more recent exhibitions, Descent, which we'll come to. But that, I mean, I think that might be a good way to explore that question a bit.
Yeah, I'm just looking at time. So I'm just going to show this image just to say, you know, we've talked a lot about the body in public space, and this question of interiority and exteriority, and that's an ongoing concern of yours. So just wanted to show this work, Liquid Gold.
And actually, this is like an ongoing work where I kind of treat the light as having some sort of physicality, and it fills various spaces, and you only see it from the outside, and usually it as an inversion of the kind of space or gallery museum hours. This sort of work also has a relationship to the resin works that I make, because I sort of think of them a bit like an extrusion of a space. So seeing an object through a particular kind of lighting condition, going back to that kind of idea of really things that are sort of transportative.
I like also the way in which they kind of play with this question of belonging, because I think that's really key to this 3-part exhibition, Descent. So maybe you could talk us through why an exhibition in 3 parts and what those parts are for a couple of minutes, and then we'll turn to questions.
Okay. So I kind of, I felt like what I wanted to say at the time was bigger than the kind of space somehow. And like, so I decided to sort of split that into these kind of different episodes. And it was also about kind of like forging a new relationship with the viewer somehow. So like perhaps some people might only come to one part. There were 3 parts. It was like a trilogy of exhibitions. And some people might just come to one part, and how would that affect how they saw the other one? So I kind of enjoyed working in that way. And the overarching title was called Descent. So I was thinking about descent both as a passage through time and space, as well as descent as a kind of lineage in a way. And like I mentioned, how I've been making a lot of work about these sex spaces that I've kind of grown up going to. And in this instance, I was kind of maybe thinking a little bit more critically about some of my experiences in those spaces. And the first part at the Gallery Southern Reed, whom I work with in London, was like quite an immersive situation, which really took the viewer like directly to a different space altogether. So it was modeled on a men-only cruising club in the neighborhood of the gallery. So you see the door was kind of left ajar, and I'd installed a completely new floor, all this corrugated steel. I'd lowered the ceilings, and I'd essentially created a replica of this cruising club not far from the gallery. And so it was like a one-to-one immersive installation. And I was trying to think about like what it meant to have this sort of parallel version of the club where I could maybe kind of orchestrate an image somehow, an image that I feel like maybe doesn't get a chance to be seen outside of that space. And I had this performer that was sometimes present and sometimes not. As a viewer, you may go to the space and you just walk down this very narrow passageway to this kind of archway, and there may be remnants of someone having been there, or there was potentially this body. So I kind of used a specific demographic to explore with this work, and that was like a white male performer who was sometimes there, as I mentioned, and sometimes not. And they always appeared to be kind of sleeping or passed out, as though they were somehow kind of, oblivious or unawake to their surroundings.
And then always white men, right?
Yes.
I mean, a particular kind of body in this space. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think like those works with the relief are sort of trying to explore like a kind of somatic norm, and how I don't know, kind of like whiteness and desire converge in relation to kind of experiences I've had as a person of color in these spaces, and sort of maybe questioning like those spaces as, or kind of this question of like, could the construction of certain spaces also be like a trap in a way? And so 3 weeks later, after this very kind of long performance in a way, you came back to the gallery for the second part, which was called Culdesac. So all the installation had been stripped away, and there was just a vitrine of archival material and a video. And the material belonged to my uncle, who was my dad's brother. And my dad passed away in 2018. And that kind of led me to ask a lot of questions about his experiences as an immigrant coming to this country. And my uncle sort of facilitated that curiosity by sharing with me a folder of material that he just kept personally. So it wasn't like a kind of public archive or anything. It was just stuff that was important to him, as someone who had lived in this area, the same area that I grew up in. He had done a lot of outreach work with young people and was part of what was known as the Southall Youth Movement, where lots of younger people were mobilizing in the late 70s and early 80s against racism, because there were like really heightened tensions in that area and many race riots towards the end of the 70s. So these are histories that I was kind of aware of, but I felt like they were not very often spoken about in the kind of familial setting. So like, I just felt it was so generous for him to share this material with me. And as I happened to be making a video about my experience of the same space, it became a way for like these two intersectional perspectives of the same area to coexist. So the archive became a bit like a historical and contextual device for the video, which was shot using a drone. And I'll kind of briefly explain it, but I think we can maybe share the link to the video if anyone wants to watch. Also, the QR code is for the archive. So I also had this in the space because it was so dense. I wanted it to be able to exist outside of the physicality of the gallery. So you can scan that code and it will lead you to a PDF of the archival material that I shared. And the video, as I mentioned, was shot on the street that I grew up on. And I used a drone that kind of went up and down the street, almost kind of taking this very familiar path of just walking up and down the same space every day. And then there's a point where it sort of transcends up and you get this aerial view of the arrangement of houses and this quite sort of phallic shape of the cul-de-sac. And the soundtrack was quite important because it was all these fragments I had collected over the years of arguments with my boyfriend and recordings made in and outside of nightclubs. And also like my dad sort of playing the flute not long before he passed away. But I was kind of thinking about a consciousness slipping away, or kind of, you know, something leaving where it lives. And then the kind of drone footage also kind of brought in some ideas around surveillance too, which I think maybe they were more emphasized because the archive being in the same space. But it had quite a trippy effect, and I used some of these effects on the footage to kind of make it feel that way.
There's also, so let's move to the third show, the third kind of chapter in the show, because I think one thing that carries through to this between those two really strongly for me is there's a subtext of brutality. There's a kind of violence that you're kind of grappling with the archival record of, and then this work also deals with that more explicitly. So maybe you could tell everybody about this Obsidian Mirror, and then
Sure. So this work is made using obsidian, which is a kind of volcanic glass. So as a material, I feel like it embodies sort of like a lot of trauma in the way in which it was formed. So I was kind of like interested in that, but also its relationship to like historic scrying devices, which were, I first came across obsidian mirrors in Pompeii, basically. And scrying is this kind of old practice where you look into reflected surfaces to receive divinations and messages. So there was something about this black mirror in that material that was also screen-like, and they began as slightly smaller works, which I placed in public situations. So they were kind of public-facing mirrors initially, and they kind of reveal all these scars of how they're produced, but they have this sort of like relationship to the screen. So they look a bit like kind of cracked communication devices in a way. And this one, I used a device called a sound exciter, which turns the object into a speaker. And it played an audio track that was recorded in an online chat room. And this kind of encounter I had with this racist guy in the States. And I was just like, really, it's like, I think I mentioned to you earlier, it's a work that I kind of struggle to talk about in a way, because it's sort of like, it goes into being hate speech, but then there's something so interesting about some of the things he's saying. And I found that he was constantly, well, not constantly, but often referring to like dogs in various ways, like British bulldogs or wolves in sheep's clothing, but also talking about how he goes onto this chat room and how he spoke to a dog the other day. And it sort of allowed me to think a little bit about this sort of like these relationships of power and sort of like subservience and again, kind of domesticity. And I think, you know, the first part of the Descent exhibitions went from being in a club, the second part into, you know, the organization of the street. And then this third and final part was more like being inside the home. So because I have worked with this audio track that was, you know, included like horrible racial slurs, and it was just, you know, I didn't want to give more space, or I was aware of not giving more space to this kind of hate speech. So I tried to treat it quite sculpturally, and I sort of stretched it in a way that kind of made it sound very abstracted most of the time. So you might come into the exhibition and it would sound a bit like almost like tectonic plates or something moving. It's a really groany, growly kind of sound. And then on the hour, you would have this kind of monologue by this man. You just hear me typing, which again kind of like maybe accentuates the screenness of it all, of that encounter. But then you also hear his kind of 15-minute rant. And then on the floor were these kind of ramshackle, kind of quite odd sculptures called Bobby, Ozo, and Sam, which were named after dead pets of mine. And they were placed on newspapers. So rather than the archival material I had in the vitrine, these were like newspapers from, you know, a few weeks ago or something. So they kind of spoke more of the contemporary moment that we are in. And some of them include things to do, like this one in particular, I think it's got there's this article where there's this kind of this gender fraud narrative. But essentially I made these kind of baskets which looked a bit like, you know, something an animal might sleep in, or something that you might throw discarded clothes into. And these blankets came about through me looking at men's shirting fabrics and sort of recognizing what looked like bars and cage-like patterns in them. So on one side you have this sort of fake fur, and the other side you have this shirting. So they were 3 still lifes with various components, and all the materials were kind of thought about quite meticulously. So what looks like Coca-Cola in this sort of begging bowl is resin, and these monkey nuts are actually cast in bronze. So they kind of have a weightiness to them. And like I say, they kind of frame different things to do with housing and home. And yeah.
Okay, I'm going to show the last still, but I'm also going to stop sharing so that we can turn to questions. But we'll just show this is 4 sets of cast legs, so 8 in total. It just kind of sit behind this wall, so all you see are the kind of feet. And I'm going to
Mhm.
stop sharing, but ask you, as I look through these questions, to talk a little bit. You've described it as a spider.
Yeah, so basically, I should have maybe mentioned that the third and final part was more like an object response to the first two parts of the exhibition. And so in thinking about that, work was called beneficiary. So I was sort of thinking about who is the beneficiary of the space. And I used these kind of 8 legs that they look like 4 people, I guess, but collectively, I kind of thought about them as like a group body, so like a collective body in a way, like that of the spider. The spider kind of creates this matrix, as in the web, which becomes a trap. So there was this sort of metaphor there as well for a certain type of body and a certain type of collective body, as well as an individual body being a beneficiary of the space.
So in relation, I think we have one question that's great in relationship to Mandog, because it's about sound. So this person asks, does music play a role in your studio practice? Do you listen to music? And if so, what inspires you while you work? And just thinking that would be relevant here. So do you?
Sound has come into my work in the past. I've also kind of co-run a club night for many years with 2 other artists, George Henry Longley and Eddie Peake. But do I listen to music in the studio? Yeah, that and podcasts. So yeah.
Another person asks, what work do you admire of other artists, living or dead, and why? And I have to ask this also in relationship to the cast resin works. Every time I see the fountain, I of course think of Gober. I'm wondering if that's a reference for you too.
I really love Gober's work. So that was one that I was going to mention anyway. But yeah, I mean, I struggle with this question because there's so many people whose work I really like. At the moment, I'm also working on a project space. So there's like lots of younger artists whose work I'm around and really enjoy looking at. But yeah, in terms, like you mentioned Gober, I really like Benglis as well, Linda Benglis and Rosemary Trockle. I mean, there's many. Yeah. I think like, especially when there's this sort of like economy of, working with materials that can be quite loaded in a way.
And also, it's interesting also to ask this question in relationship to the club night you just mentioned, because I know you also have a kind of more experimental space that you have been running for presenting work too. And I'm just thinking, like, sort of collaboration is a kind of separate aspect of your practice as an artist that maybe you could talk a little bit about.
Yeah, so that's when I mentioned like this, the younger artists whom I'm around and having, well, not all young, but we began a project space in my friend George Henry Longley's studio, really just during the pandemic, and again, kind of a consequence of development that's happening in London, which is resulting in studio closure. So he had an exhibition there, and we've since been running it with some other. It's kind of like an artist-run space essentially, and it's been really great. We've had like an exhibition almost every week. So we currently got on a really great show by a photographer called Henry Mills. Next week, there's an artist called Joe Fraser. So it's like a really quick turnaround because there's sort of an urgency to be working with the space while we have it. And it's called Ridley Road Project Space.
Yes. Another question just came in is somebody's asking about associating tile now with cladding and couches with yellow police tape barring them. And have you noticed that your work has kind of evolved, or your associations with these materials have evolved since you began working with them?
Of course, yeah. And I think, that's something that is something that I'm aware of. And like, I also, I kind of know that I'm crafting narratives in relation to things that mean something to me.
Right. Well, along those lines, another question that's come in is someone's asking about the kind of different cultures that may have contributed to your perspectives and your work, and kind of where you've looked outside of your own framework. And so is there kind of interest in This person's asking specifically if you've ever worked also with Africa or artists from Africa, and particularly Ghana.
No, I haven't before. I mean, my dad was born in Kenya and then came to London via India, but I haven't, is the answer to the question.
Fair enough. And then somebody was asking, which I think is a great question as we're winding down, is kind of what's going on next? What are you looking forward to?
But actually, I'm currently working on a book which expands on the 3 exhibitions and kind of takes that episodic structure of them into different chapters. And I'm kind of also working with more archival material in a way, but kind of like through WhatsApp conversations I'm having with family members. So I'm trying to like extend that, and because I was thinking about like the history of policing in the area is so prevalent in some of the material that my uncle had. And then, you know that, say, my brother has had his own relationship with the police in a way. And so I kind of didn't want to just stick to thinking about policing in the 80s and 90s, but also kind of, sorry, in the 70s and 80s, but also kind of speak to how that's evolved in the area in a way through different family members and friends. So yeah, the book project is the main thing that I'm working on right now.
Are the WhatsApp conversations gonna find themselves in the book project?
I hope so, yeah. At the moment, I'm sort of just gathering material, and it's just a kind of where I've sort of landed as a sort of point of interest right now. I think that they might be sort of taken away from some of the language of WhatsApp, but I'm really interested in it as a sort of social space as well, especially during the pandemic. And it's sort of become this way to have difficult conversations with people, because it kind of gives people space to respond and think about their response. And so, yeah, I'm sort of trying to gather material out of the way, and then I'm hoping that will come into it.
That's so fascinating. I've been thinking a lot about that with Zoom, like the format that we're on, right? The way the chat functions is a kind of side space to ask the questions that you don't ask, even though you have the opportunity to talk kind of face to face. People ask the harder questions often in that kind of secondary space.
Exactly.
Some anonymity helps. Sorry, last question before we close here. Well, one person's asked if there's kind of archival element in your practice, but I think we've discussed that a little bit, especially this kind of like interest in talking about a family history, like preserving a kind of family history that's also a larger social history. The bit of red and painting behind you, which I happen to know is a work in progress, but not everybody here does, but now they do.
Yeah.
But that looks like it's from one of the exhibitions we saw. Does it have a particularly heightened importance to you? But maybe you could talk about the moving to the red series.
Yeah, so I think in exploring this kind of idea of descent as kind of lineage, the substance, like I mentioned, on the surface has these different kind of registers, and like when I moved to red, I began thinking more about bloodlines, and the painting that you saw an image of has this kind of line that kind of goes from the outside of the painting into the surface and out again. And I'm thinking about I'm doing a new painting where that line doesn't quite meet the other end and it becomes disrupted halfway. So yeah, it's a kind of it's another work in that series, basically. And then the other thing, maybe just to touch on, I know we sort of spoke about archiving quite a lot, but some of these things are also to try and think about how you complicate master narratives in archives as well. And that's maybe why I hope with the book project I can go more personal to familiar relationships too.
Yeah, that's such an interesting through line in your work in general, right? Like kind of complicating, even as you were talking about, thinking about the relationship to minimalism and kind of trying to disrupt it or complicate its kind of dominant narrative.
Yeah.
And thinking about the body, like by indexing a body and a personal body in particular. Thank you so much, Prem, for participating in this. And I'm afraid that we've just run out of time, but I want to, just say how grateful I am to have had the opportunity to connect and talk with you again after
Thank you.
such a long time. and invite everybody to join the Center for its next online program, which will be a conversation taking place on Friday, February 4th at 12 p.m. with artists Simone Lee and Sonia Boyce, moderated by Courtney Martin, the Paul Mellon Director at the Yale Center for British Art. So please join us again, and thank you all so much for coming today. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.